As a tech leader, you're guaranteed to be making a lot of mistakes. That's part of the role. However, while it is important to ensure that you take responsibility for those mistakes, I want to make sure that you don't end up beating yourself up too much for it. You need to learn the right balance between taking responsibility and taking all of the responsibility, because many times it is not all your fault. And this is critical if you want to succeed and stick in these sorts of positions for the long term. I'm Aviv Ben-Yosef. I help tech leaders create engineering teams worth leading, because life is too short to lead average teams. And today we'll talk precisely about when it is your fault, when it isn't, how to discern it, and what you should be doing about it. Now, let's start with a disclaimer. I agree you ought to be taking responsibility for the mistakes you make, and even for the mistakes that you didn't personally make, but that were done under your purview in your organization. I love the extreme ownership concept of Jocko Willink. If you haven't read that book or listened to, I recommend it as an audiobook. And it's important because nowadays in too many organizations, what we lack is ownership, is taking this responsibility. Nevertheless, the problem arises when we start mixing this concept with our own self-confidence, with our own self-esteem, and start thinking that anything that is wrong that happens in the company is our own fault. You're not that important. If you think like that all the time, you will eventually burn out. You will lose your confidence. You will not be able to do your role. So it is critical that we learn how to balance these two concepts, knowing how to distance ourselves from some of the things and yet taking ownership. In fact, I'm talking about this today because recently I had conversations with several CTOs, VPs of engineering, who all had this concept weaved in their careers. Someone who was very sad about the company making an M&A decision, acquiring a startup that didn't fit, and he felt bad for not being aware of the process as the CTO and potentially telling it was a problem ahead of time. Another is a CTO who ended up seeing his organization getting laid off, thinking maybe I could have done something different earlier to avoid it. Another was a CTO who just got fired. And it happens, but he naturally started thinking this was all his fault, and he made this all about his disadvantages and his failures, and missed out on the fact that if you viewed the entire context, it wasn't solely his fault. It wasn't solely what he did. And perhaps even a different CTO, or even had he acted differently, things would have gone the same way. So these are all important for us to keep in mind so we don't end up beating ourselves too much. And as we're going to be talking about a few of the ways that you can tell how much you should be beating yourself up about something, I want to give you one main theme to keep in mind that is the reason I'm recording this video. The reason I think the takeaway here is critical for people in these roles. And that is, if you've learned a bit about optimism and pessimism, about our ability to view things positively and get things done in the long term and not burn out, you know how critical it is to not make yourself feel like you're always the issue and become pessimistic. There's an amazing book called Learned Optimism by Seligman, and in it he describes that it's critical. And one thing that many natural optimists do is when there's a success, when I succeed at something, I generalize it. So if I did well on an exam, I don't say, yeah, I did well in that specific exam. I say, I handle exams well. I'm a good student. And vice versa. When there's a failure, we try and not generalize it, but specify it. Make it just that particular situation. So yeah, that day I wasn't well prepared for that exam. If I botched an interview, I say that interview did not go well, not I suck at interviews. Okay, so we specify it and we distance ourselves from it. So it's not me solely, it's that interview didn't go well as opposed to I didn't interview well. That might sound like semantics, but research shows us that this is actually critical if you want to become more optimistic or maintain your optimism in this hard career. It's not trivial to maintain this, and I always tell my clients that the best executives I work with have this innate ability to maintain optimism, to have this outlook that's assuming things will work out, because otherwise you will never try and achieve anything that's above the average. If you think that anything in the end will just average out and you're just going to get the average, you're not likely to push yourself. And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't like that. I don't think that's a life worth living. So, with that in mind, this is the reason, this is the takeaway. You will need to learn how to not do this so you don't burn out. Let's talk about how you can start noticing when it is your fault and when it isn't. First of all, I want you to consider when there's a big mistake, when there's something that you really feel bad about, consider, was it even your role? And it might sound trivial at first, because why would I worry about something that wasn't my role? But the best executives I work with, the best leaders, they tend to be all-arounders. They don't look at things just within their fence and say, no, that's her role, that's his job. They are team players, and therefore they also naturally feel bad when something bad happens, even if it wasn't specifically their role. And that's good. However, when something goes awry and it wasn't just within your role, so it's not solely within your organization that made the screw up, for example, when that happens, you automatically need to tell yourself, yes, I maybe share some of the responsibility, but it wasn't all on me, or even the majority wasn't on me. And this is important, again, to keep in the back of your mind so you don't take up too much of these failures for your own. You're going to have enough of your own failures. You don't need to pile on these that belong to other people. It's okay to be responsible. It's okay to share the responsibility, to have accountability, but it's not all on you. Stop being so egoistic and thinking that everything revolves around you. Now, when you're thinking about other failures, I want you to genuinely ask yourself, did you do your best? Sometimes this is hard to do just by introspection alone, and this is something that I do a lot with my clients, but even just journaling, I always have my notebook, I always try and write things down. It really helps me process things. Just take a few minutes and consider, did you genuinely do your best? Sometimes things failed even if you did your best. And now doing your best doesn't mean that now, with hindsight, knowing everything you know right now, you could have done things differently, because that's always going to be the case. You're always going to be smarter later. Sometimes we have to look at things that we do, consider, given the knowledge that we had, the skills that we had, the situation we were in, did you do your best or not? And if you did your best, if given the information you had, you made the right call, or you made a call that makes sense, if you look at it in hindsight and say, that was one of a few logical options to take, then you did your best. And sometimes we're going to have those failures. Specify it. In that situation, given what you knew, you did your best, and still that wasn't enough, or still that failed. Okay, that happens. But that doesn't mean that you are a bad leader. That doesn't mean you will always make the same types of mistakes. That was a bad one. Shrug it off and continue. Something that will make you feel better, I think, is even if you didn't do your best, or it was all under your purview, you were responsible for all of it. I say, if we learn from it, if you actually sat down and you had a post-mortem with your team because you had a major outage, if you had an introspection, or you sat with a coach, or you sat with a buddy, and you thought about it, and you really learned from that mistake, meaning you are now better, even if you made that mistake, you, again, stop chastising yourself about it. It happens. You're never going to be perfect. No one is perfect. Even the most successful companies and the most successful entrepreneurs they all have track records filled with failures, filled with obstacles that they took too long to overcome or never did. That's fine. That's part of being human. You just need to keep improving, keep learning. So if you really learn from it, if you took the time to ensure that the next time something similar happens, you're not likely to be making the same mistake, because I'm all for making new mistakes. That error, that mistake, however grave it was, at least had some good in it. At least you now are better. At least you've gotten better at your role. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger if you learn from it. If you don't learn from it, what doesn't kill you just might kill you tomorrow. So learn from it, and then you can feel better about it. At least you had a growth opportunity here. Make use of it. Exploit it instead of just letting it be useless. And one last point that I think is critical is to know, and I can tell you, it's sometimes hard to tell when you're working in one company for 3, 4 years, because that's all you see. I can tell you from my point of view, from someone who talks to hundreds of executives and founders every year, that a lot of the times, even when you could have done better, even if sometimes a founder tells me, I could have put all of my weight into that to change that course, to change that decision, and I probably could have made that call. And that's a possibility. Maybe you could have burnt out, really used all of your political strength in the company, went all out with your co-founders just to make that decision happen differently. That's possible. You could have done it had you forced everything within you to make it happen. Usually, when that's the case, when it requires such heroic efforts to make something right, what ends up happening is that that's not the only one. What you're doing is postponing something inevitable, because there are more of these disagreements where you are not aligned with the team, or when the company is already in such a shaky situation that you cannot always be the hero. No matter how relentless you are, we all have our own limits. We all have some reserves. It's just narcissistic thinking that if only I would give it all of my attention and all of my power, it would be perfect, because it wouldn't. But you would maybe be successful in postponing it a bit. Maybe it would have been enough, maybe not. But it's important to realize that just avoiding one failure does not mean the next one wouldn't have happened. And it doesn't mean that you could have done the same, put all of your weight into decision after decision, problem after problem for months to keep avoiding them. Sometimes we're just postponing the inevitable. And maybe you're better off making the mistake earlier so you can learn from it, so you can realize that something is not working, as opposed to always having to play the hero. And all of these are ways for you to consider, am I doing well enough? Am I always improving? Yeah, you will make mistakes. Yeah, you're not going to be perfect. But if you're constantly improving, you're guaranteed to be better now than you were in the past, and guaranteed to be better in a year than you are today. I think that's pretty good. Having worked with so many people, I sometimes see those people who remain stuck at best. Sometimes they actually are, coasting downhill and they're not noticing it till it's too late. If you're constantly improving, if you're always asking yourself, what am I learning? What did I do wrong? What could I have done better? And not to the point where, you get to the brink of self-destruction because you see everything that you did as being so bad. But by learning from it and knowing when it is your fault, when it isn't, when it's partly, you can then start moving forward. So even if it's just partially your fault, learn from it and take responsibility, but don't make it solely your issue. There's no reason to do that, and it's just not viable as a career. And if I need to summarize this, I sometimes tell my clients that you ought not make excuses all the time. If you use what we just talked about, you just make excuses even when it is your fault, even when you have some responsibility, that's not going to fly. So don't use this as carte blanche to make a bunch of excuses. But this is about realizing that you don't need to make yourself the center of the universe. Not everything is about you. The company and the universe don't revolve around you. Sometimes even if you had made a better decision, it wouldn't have fixed things. There are other people involved. There's the universe involved. So don't beat yourself up too much about it, but make a commitment to always learn from things, to assess and become better. Thank you. And if you want to assess and become better, I think you might like the new assessment I created for tech executives to make an assessment and review of their year to ensure that coming the next one, you will do even better. It's free and there's a worksheet you can download. The link will be in the description of the video. Ciao.